Picture the vast, wind-swept steppes of ancient Eurasia, a sea of grass stretching endlessly under an open sky. Now, imagine the thunder of hooves as a horde of warriors appears on the horizon, moving like a storm across the land. These are the Scythians, nomadic horsemen whose very name struck terror into the hearts of empires. To the Greeks, they were barbarians. To the Persians, they were nightmares made flesh. But to history, they were something far more fascinating, masters of unconventional warfare, a people who turned the art of battle into a terrifying spectacle of cunning and brutality. Their tactics were so shocking, so brutally effective, that even the mightiest armies of the ancient world trembled at their approach. What made the Scythians so feared? It wasn't just their skill with a bow or their unmatched horsemanship, it was their willingness to break every rule of war. They didn't fight like anyone else. They vanished into the landscape, striking without warning and melting away before their enemies could react. They used psychological terror, leaving trails of mutilated corpses to sap the morale of those who pursued them. They turned the land itself into a weapon, poisoning wells and burning grasslands to starve their foes. These weren't just warriors, they were shadowy architects of chaos, and their methods were as ingenious as they were ruthless. Today, we're uncovering the secrets of their success: 25 unconventional warfare tactics that made the Scythians legends of the ancient world. From their use of poisoned arrows to their mastery of guerrilla ambushes, these strategies weren't just effective, they were decades ahead of their time. Some will shock you, others might even make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient combat. But one thing's certain: by the end of this journey, you'll understand why the Scythians remain one of history's most formidable fighting forces. So saddle up, we're riding deep into the past to uncover the brutal, brilliant mind of the steppe warriors who defied empires and rewrote the rules of war. The Scythians didn't just run from battle, they weaponized retreat itself. One of their most devastating tricks was the feigned retreat, a tactic so perfectly executed that even veteran commanders fell for it time and again. Picture this: a band of Scythian horsemen charging toward a disciplined Persian formation, loosing a volley of arrows before suddenly wheeling their horses as if seized by panic. To an enemy general, it looked like weakness, a hasty, disorganized flight. But that was the trap. The moment pursuers broke ranks to chase them down, the Scythians would pivot, their mounts spinning as if on a dime, and unleash a storm of arrows into the now scattered foe. History remembers how Darius the Great, ruler of the mighty Persian Empire, marched north with an army rumored in the hundreds of thousands, determined to crush the Scythian menace once and for all. But the Scythians refused to give him the battle he wanted. Instead, they led Darius on a maddening chase across the endless steppe, their retreat always just out of reach. When Persian forces grew fatigued and strung out, the Scythians struck not with a grand head-on clash, but with swift, surgical attacks that bled Darius's army dry. It wasn't just arrows that whittled away at Persian morale. It was the psychological torment of never landing a decisive blow, of being toyed with by an enemy who seemed to vanish like smoke. But the genius of the feigned retreat wasn't just in the ambush, it was in the way the Scythians exploited human nature itself. They understood something primal about their enemies: pride. A retreating foe triggers a conqueror's instinct, the irresistible urge to chase down what appears to be victory. The Scythians stoked that arrogance, letting their enemies believe they had the upper hand right up until the moment the noose tightened. And when their pursuers finally realized the truth, that they hadn't been the hunters, but the prey all along, it was already too late. The steppe was littered with the corpses of those who underestimated the oldest trick in the book. Sometimes running away is the deadliest move of all. While their feigned retreat sowed chaos, the Scythians' true battlefield supremacy came from an even deadlier skill: horse archery, perfected into an art of annihilation. Picture a swirling storm of riders encircling their prey, each warrior loosing arrow after arrow without ever breaking stride. This wasn't just archery, it was a ballet of destruction, a tactic that turned the open steppe into a killing field where slower armies withered under endless volleys. The secret lay in their composite bows, crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, a weapon so powerful it could punch through armor at 200 paces, yet compact enough to fire from horseback with terrifying speed. From the moment a Scythian boy could sit upright, he was tied to a saddle, learning to knock arrows at full gallop before he could read or write. By adulthood, these warriors could pivot in their stirrups and land shots with inhuman precision forward, backward, even sideways, all while their horses moved like extensions of their own bodies. The Greeks, who prided themselves on phalanx formations and close combat, were baffled by an enemy that refused to stand still. Herodotus described the nightmare of facing them. They fight as if they were dancing, always just out of reach, turning the air black with their arrows. What made these barrages so devastating wasn't just accuracy, it was the sheer volume of fire. A single Scythian rider could unleash a dozen arrows in the time it took a Greek hoplite to advance 20 paces. When multiplied by hundreds of circling horsemen, the effect was apocalyptic. Persian commanders wrote of skies darkening as if locusts had descended, their ranks thinning long before they could close the distance. And when enemies did charge, the Scythians simply melted away, only to regroup and resume the slaughter from another angle. This wasn't battle as the ancient world knew it, it was systematic erosion, death by 1,000 cuts delivered from the backs of the fastest horses on earth. The Scythians didn't just wound their enemies, they made sure every scratch was a death sentence. Among their most feared weapons were arrows tipped with a gruesome concoction, venom extracted from steppe vipers, mixed with decaying blood and other toxins. Even a glancing hit could spell agony as the poison seared through veins, turning minor wounds into horrific ordeals. Herodotus recounted the fate of those struck. Limbs swelling grotesquely, skin blackening as if burned, victims choking on their own blood as the toxins ravaged their bodies. For opposing armies, the terror wasn't just in dying. It was in watching comrades succumb to something invisible, a fate worse than a clean blade. This wasn't merely chemistry, it was psychological warfare. Imagine standing in a Persian shield wall, arrows thudding into the ground around you. One grazes your shoulder, hardly a wound worth noting in the heat of battle. But within hours, fever sets in, your muscles lock. The stench of rotting flesh rises from your own body as the venom does its work. The Scythians knew that fear spreads faster than poison. When enemies realized even a near miss could kill, their formations grew hesitant, their archers reluctant to trade volleys with warriors whose arrows carried the touch of death. The brilliance of these poisoned arrows lay in their efficiency. A single skilled horseman could cripple an entire unit without ever closing to melee range. Greek historians wrote of abandoned battlefields where the only sound was the moans of dying men, their commanders helpless to stop the slow creep of venom through their ranks. And the Scythians, always just out of reach, would circle like wolves, waiting for the poison to do its work before moving in to finish the survivors. In an era before germ theory, this seemed like dark magic, an unstoppable force that turned the very air between armies into a lethal space. To face the Scythians wasn't just to risk death, it was to gamble on how horribly you might meet it. While their poisoned arrows struck terror into individual soldiers, the Scythians wielded an even broader weapon against entire armies, the land itself. When Darius the Great's forces marched into their territory, expecting to live off the land as conquering armies always had, they found something horrifying: nothing. The Scythians had transformed their own homeland into a weapon by systematically burning crops, driving off livestock, and smashing or poisoning every well along the Persian advance. What should have been fertile steppe became a wasteland, forcing Darius' troops to ration dwindling supplies while the Scythians simply melted deeper into the wilderness. This scorched earth strategy worked because the Scythians lived by a different rulebook than settled civilizations. Nomadic herders needed no granaries or fixed settlements. Their wealth walked on four legs. When danger came, they could pack their yurts, round up their herds, and vanish into the horizon, leaving nothing of value behind. But agricultural empires like Persia depended on seizing enemy crops to feed their massive armies. The moment the Scythians denied them that, Darius' campaign was doomed. Greek historians described Persian soldiers gnawing on roots and boiled leather as starvation set in. Their supply lines stretched to breaking point across hundreds of miles of barren grassland. The genius of this approach echoes through military history. Centuries later, Russian generals would use similar tactics against Napoleon, and Vietnamese guerrillas against American forces, using the landscape itself as an ally. But the Scythians perfected it first. They understood something fundamental about warfare. Sometimes victory comes not from confronting strength, but from dismantling the systems that make strength possible. By turning their homeland into a trap rather than a prize, they rendered the Persian war machine helpless. No matter how many soldiers Darius brought, none could eat gold or drink prestige. In the end, the most powerful empire on earth retreated in disgrace, outmaneuvered by a people who proved that survival could be deadlier than conquest. Long before satellites or drones, the Scythians waged war with something far more subtle. An invisible web of eyes and ears stretched across the steppe. Their true advantage wasn't just horsemanship or archery, but an unmatched spy network that turned the vast grasslands into a living trap. When Persian armies marched, the Scythians always seemed to know their every move because they did scouts disguised as shepherds or traders watched roadways, while mounted outriders shadowed enemy columns from a distance, counting soldiers and mapping supply routes. These weren't just observers, they were human radar feeding intelligence to war bands that struck with surgical precision. Take Darius' invasion. As his army lumbered north, Scythian spies noted where his grain wagons clustered, which river crossings bottlenecked his troops, even when the Persians' discipline began fraying from exhaustion. When the time was right, raids erupted like clockwork, not against the main force, but against vulnerable supply trains miles behind the lines. The Persians would wake to find their grain stores ablaze and their water skins slit, with no enemy in sight. Herodotus recorded the demoralizing effect. They made the earth itself conspire against us, as if every blade of grass whispered our secrets to the wind. What made this system revolutionary was its structure. Unlike settled empires that relied on slow, centralized command, Scythian scouts operated like a murmuration of starlings, independent yet instantly coordinated. A lone rider spotting enemy movement could relay signals with smoke or mirrored flashes, triggering a chain reaction that marshaled war bands across hundreds of miles within hours. Modern special forces would recognize the tactics: deep reconnaissance, rapid information sharing, and lightning strikes on high-value targets. But the Scythians did it without maps or couriers, using an oral tradition so precise that scouts could describe terrain features down to the twist of a river bend. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical blows. Opposing armies grew paranoid, never knowing whether the figure on the distant hill was a harmless nomad or a scout marking their position for annihilation. This shadow army gave the Scythians something no fortress could provide: perfect situational awareness. While their enemies groped blindly through unfamiliar land, the Scythians fought with the confidence of those who'd turned the very air between them into a conduit for whispers of war. The Scythians understood something modern generals still wrestle with: war isn't just fought with blades and arrows, but with the minds of those who wield them. Two of their most chilling tactics targeted not just enemy soldiers, but their ability to think, coordinate, or even trust one another. When an opposing force sent messengers to rally allies or call for reinforcements, the Scythians made sure those pleas never arrived. Scouts would intercept runners, beheading them and leaving the mutilated corpses where patrols would find them. the message was clear: speak and you die. Without orders or updates, isolated units became paralyzed, their commanders unaware of battles raging just over the horizon. This wasn't mere brutality, it was systems hacking, ancient style. The Persian Empire's strength lay in its communication network, with royal roads and relay stations allowing orders to traverse continents in days. The Scythians severed those lifelines. During Darius' invasion, Persian outposts waited in vain for dispatches that never came, while main columns marched blindly into ambushes. The historian Polyaenus described the aftermath. Whole divisions wandered like blind men, clutching orders that were already obsolete. But silent corpses were only half the strategy. The Scythians also mastered the art of the honeyed lie. Greek colonies along the Black Sea learned this the hard way. Nomadic riders would approach city gates bearing gifts, fine furs, golden trinkets, even promises of trade alliances. Local leaders, eager for steppe goods, would welcome them inside. Days later, those same allies would throw open the gates under cover of darkness, unleashing warbands to pillage at will. The psychological damage lingered long after the raids. Communities that survived grew paranoid, turning on neighbors suspected of collusion. Trade routes withered as merchants feared every smiling stranger. By alternating between silence and false friendship, the Scythians turned their enemies' greatest strengths, communication and diplomacy, into fatal weaknesses. A Persian general summed up the despair in his scrolls: "To fight them is to battle ghosts who wear the faces of friends." These tactics reveal a deeper truth about the Scythian way of war. They didn't just want victory, they wanted their enemies to feel utterly alone, trapped in a world where every outstretched hand might hide a dagger, and every cry for help would vanish into the wind. In the end, the most terrifying weapon wasn't the arrow or the blade, but the gnawing certainty that no one was coming to save you. The Scythians turned ordinary wagons into rolling castles of death, a mobile fortress tactic so effective it baffled empires accustomed to storming stone walls. When threatened on the open steppe, their warriors would lash heavy carts together in a defensive ring, creating an instant stronghold bristling with archers. These weren't mere barriers. Each wagon became a raised platform, giving bowmen clear lines of fire while their enemies floundered outside the circle like fish trapped in a net. Greek historians describe the sight: a seemingly chaotic huddle of wagons transforming before their eyes into an impregnable fortress, arrows arcing outward in deadly unison. Archaeology reveals just how sophisticated these structures were. Burial mounds across Ukraine and southern Russia have yielded wagon frames reinforced with iron brackets, some still holding quivers of arrows and recurved bows. The axles were engineered for rapid assembly, a feature that allowed Scythian bands to erect defenses in minutes when ambushed. One particularly gruesome discovery near the Dnieper River contained a chieftain's wagon buried with 30 quivers, suggesting these mobile forts could rain down hundreds of arrows per minute. Unlike static fortresses, the death wagons could move with the battle, advancing or retreating as needed while maintaining cover. The genius of this system lay in its flexibility. Against cavalry charges, the terror of ancient warfare, the wagon ring broke the momentum of thundering horsemen. Mounted attackers would find their path blocked by solid wooden walls while archers picked them off from above. When facing infantry, the Scythians would suddenly open gaps in the circle, luring enemies into deadly funnels where they'd be cut down from 3 sides. And if the tide turned against them, they could dismantle the fortress just as quickly, scattering across the steppe before regrouping elsewhere. Roman generals later copied this tactic against Germanic tribes, but none matched the Scythians' mastery. Their wagons weren't just transport, they were the nomadic equivalent of castle walls, allowing a people without cities to outmaneuver empires that measured strength in brick and mortar. Even in death, the message was clear: for the Scythians, home wasn't a place. It was whatever ground they chose to defend, even if that ground rolled on wheels. While most armies hibernated during winter's grip, the Scythians turned biting cold into their deadliest ally. Picture the Persian Empire's finest infantry men who conquered deserts and mountains, now stumbling through knee-deep snow, their sandaled feet blackening with frostbite as temperatures plunged below anything their Mediterranean homeland had prepared them for. Meanwhile, the Scythians moved like ghosts across frozen rivers, their felt-lined boots and fur-cloaked riders gliding effortlessly over terrain that swallowed invaders whole. This was no accident of geography, it was calculated annihilation. When Darius' forces pursued them northward in late autumn, the Scythians didn't just retreat, they lured the Persians into a frozen death trap. As Persian water skins froze solid and metal armor burned skin on contact, Scythian scouts mapped their enemies' weakening march. Then, when blizzards pinned the Persians in place, nomadic war bands struck from all directions. Greek chronicles tell of entire Persian regiments found huddled around dead campfires, their swords snapped like icicles from cold, brittled metal, while Scythian arrows rained down from whiteout conditions. The secret lay in adaptation. Scythian bows used sinew strings that stayed flexible in cold, unlike Persian cordage that stiffened unpredictably. Their horses grew thick winter coats, while imported Persian steeds starved without forage buried under snow. Most brilliant of all was their use of frozen rivers as highways, flat, open corridors where wheeled Persian supply carts bogged down, but Scythian sleds and mounted archers could strike deep behind enemy lines. Herodotus recorded the survivors' despair. They fought not men, but the breath of the north wind itself. The lesson was brutal but clear. For the Scythians, winter wasn't a season to endure, but a weapon to wield. Centuries later, Russian generals would echo this strategy against Napoleon's Grand Army, proving some truths about war transcend time. The environment is never neutral, and to the prepared, even snowfall becomes an accomplice. The Scythians didn't just defeat their enemies, they turned them into macabre symbols of power. Among the most chilling artifacts recovered from their burial mounds are skulls polished smooth and lined with gold, transformed into drinking vessels. Greek historians wrote of warriors sipping wine from these ghastly cups during victory feasts, a ritual that served as both celebration and warning. To hold the literal remains of a fallen foe in your hands, to drink from what was once his head, this was psychological warfare distilled to its purest, most terrifying form. Scalping held even deeper significance. Scythian riders carried curved knives specifically designed for the task, peeling away hair and skin with practiced efficiency. These grisly trophies weren't hidden away, they dangled from bridles, stitched onto quivers, even woven into armor as moving tapestries of conquest. Herodotus described the process. A warrior cannot claim his share of plunder until he presents a scalp to the king. The message to enemies was unmistakable: defeat meant eternal humiliation, your identity reduced to decoration on the gear of your killer. But this wasn't mere barbarism. The practice mirrored broader steppe traditions where the dead served the living in unexpected ways. The Xiongnu nomads of Mongolia fashioned arrowheads from human bones, believing they carried the spirit of the deceased into battle. Later, the Mongols would pile skulls into pyramids outside conquered cities as warnings to future rebels. The Scythians took it further, blending practicality with theater. Why waste good metal on cups when your enemies provided materials? Archaeology reveals the scale of this tradition. A single burial site near the Black Sea yielded over 50 modified skulls, some showing meticulous repair work as if prized possessions. Modern forensic analysis suggests many were taken from high-status opponents, turning the downfall of champions into lasting trophies. For opposing armies, the implications were paralyzing. Death in battle was one thing, but knowing your head might adorn a chieftain's belt for generations. That horror lingered long after the fighting stopped. The brilliance lay in its dual effect. While terrifying enemies, these acts cemented warrior bonds among the Scythians themselves. Sharing wine from a general's skull wasn't just about intimidation, it transformed individuals into a brotherhood of conquerors, their shared deeds made tangible. In the brutal calculus of steppe warfare, a single scalped enemy could demoralize 100 others, making future battles shorter and bloodier. The lesson echoed across centuries. Sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't what you take from your foe, but what you force them to imagine you might. The Scythians didn't just outfight their enemies, they outthought them with a ruse so simple yet devastating that it rewrote the rules of perception in war. When Persian scouts crested a hill to survey the nomadic horde, they often saw something impossible. An army twice its actual size, its flanks stretching farther than the horizon. The secret ghost riders' straw-stuffed dummies lashed to saddles, their empty sleeves billowing in the wind as horses trotted in prearranged patterns. From a distance, each dummy became a warrior, turning a band of raiders into the illusion of an unstoppable tide. This wasn't just theater, it was mathematical warfare. A single Scythian horseman could control 3 or 4 decoy mounts using long reins, their movements choreographed to mimic the chaos of a real advance. Persian commanders, trained to estimate forces by counting banners and dust clouds, found their calculations hopelessly skewed. By the time they realized the deception, it was often too late. Their own scouts had already spread panic through the ranks, reporting a horde that existed only in the mind. The brilliance lay in its scalability. Unlike later military decoys like the inflatable tanks the Allies used in World War II, the Scythian version required no specialized materials. Straw, spare cloaks, and a few extra horses were all it took to conjure an army from thin air. And because the dummies moved authentically, even experienced officers couldn't spot the trick until they closed within arrow range, by which point the real Scythians would already be flanking them. Herodotus hints at the psychological toll. Persian dispatches spoke of warriors who multiplied like Hydra's heads, their numbers defying logic. Modern psychologists recognize the phenomenon. Under stress, the human brain inflates perceived threats. The Scythians weaponized this instinct, ensuring that every distant silhouette carried the weight of imagined peril. What makes this tactic timeless is its inversion of strength. Most armies strive to be mightier than they appear. The Scythians did the opposite. Their decoys turned emptiness into a weapon, proving that sometimes the most dangerous foe is the one you think you see, but isn't really there. Centuries later, generals would rediscover this lesson with smoke and mirrors. But the ghost riders of the steppe had already written the playbook. In war, perception can be deadlier than steel. The Scythians turned raiding into an art form, striking with the sudden fury of a summer storm, then disappearing into the grasslands before their enemies could blink. Unlike traditional armies that waged protracted sieges, these nomads had no interest in holding territory or burning cities. Their goal was simple: swoop in, take everything of value, and vanish like smoke on the wind. Picture a Greek coastal settlement at dawn, fishermen hauling nets, farmers tending vineyards when a dust cloud appears on the horizon. Within minutes, riders thunder through the gates, their arrows picking off guards while others round up livestock, smash grain stores, and strip temples of gold. By the time reinforcements arrive from neighboring towns, the raiders are already 50 miles away, dividing loot as their horses drink from mountain streams. This wasn't just banditry, it was an economic strategy perfected over centuries. Agrarian societies like Greece or Persia relied on stockpiled harvests and centralized wealth, making them irresistible targets. A single Scythian raid could gut a region's food reserves, forcing survivors to pay tribute or face starvation. Herodotus tells of colonies along the Black Sea that kept gifts ready at their gates: gold, wine, woven cloth, hoping to buy off the next attack. But the raid served a darker purpose: relentless pressure. By making settled lands feel perpetually unsafe, the Scythians ensured no rival power could grow strong enough to threaten the steppe. Compare this to classical siege warfare, where armies might spend months camped outside a city's walls. The Assyrians built siege towers, the Romans dug trenches, everyone else starved defenders into submission. The Scythians found this absurd. Why wait when you could hit 10 targets in the time it took to breach one gate? Their mobility let them exploit weaknesses no fortress could defend. Undefended villages, remote farmsteads, merchant caravans snaking through mountain passes. Archaeology reveals the scale of this system. Excavated Scythian burials contain Egyptian glass, Mesopotamian seals, and Greek amphorae, all plundered from civilizations hundreds of miles apart. Their raids weren't random. They functioned like a predatory ecosystem, skimming surplus from agrarian societies to sustain nomadic life. When Persian kings later demanded the Scythians settle down and farm, the nomads laughed. Why till soil when you could let others do the work, then take the harvest with a well-timed charge? The psychological effect reshaped entire regions. Coastal towns relocated inland, trade routes detoured around the open steppe. Some Greek colonies hired Scythian mercenaries as protection, effectively paying their would-be attackers to raid someone else. It was a self-perpetuating cycle. The more societies fragmented under pressure, the easier they became to exploit. In the end, the Scythians proved an unsettling truth. Sometimes the deadliest siege engine isn't a battering ram, but the knowledge that your walls can't stop what refuses to stay and fight. The Scythians didn't just become warriors, they were forged in a crucible of survival so harsh it would break most modern adults. From the moment a boy could grip a bowstring, he faced his ultimate test. Abandoned on the open steppe with nothing but a horse, a quiver of arrows, and the clothes on his back. This was the infamous Scythian drill, a coming-of-age ritual that turned children into lethal hunters before they hit puberty. Imagine a 10-year-old alone under the vast sky, tracking game to avoid starvation while fending off wolves with nothing but his wits and a handful of arrows. Those who returned after a full year earned their place among the warriors. Those who didn't, well, the steppe was unforgiving to the weak. Greek historians told wild tales of these trials, boys wrestling wolves barehanded, drinking horse blood when streams ran dry, even using their own teeth to stitch wounds with animal sinew. While some details may be exaggerated, archaeological evidence backs the core truth. Excavated burial sites show teenage skeletons with healed fractures and muscle attachments that suggest extreme physical stress from childhood. One particularly grim discovery in modern Ukraine revealed a boy no older than 12 buried with armor and weapons, his bones showing signs of malnutrition followed by rapid growth, a pattern consistent with surviving starvation periods before thriving as a hunter. This brutal upbringing produced fighters with supernatural endurance. Persian accounts describe Scythian warriors covering distances in days that would take other armies weeks, sleeping in the saddle while their horses trotted ceaselessly forward. They could go without food for days, then gorge on raw meat when game was plentiful, a metabolic flexibility that left grain-dependent armies baffled. When Herodotus asked how they endured such hardship, a Scythian warrior supposedly laughed and said, "You call this hardship? Try being 7 years old with a pack of winter-starved wolves on your trail." The real genius of this system wasn't just physical toughness, it forged a unique bond between rider and horse. Boys raised alongside their mounts developed an almost telepathic connection, guiding their animals with knee pressure alone while keeping both hands free for archery. By adulthood, their horses responded to shifts in body weight like extensions of their own limbs, enabling those impossible mid-gallop pivots that made Scythian archery so deadly. Legends say some boys returned from their survival year with wolf pups in tow, the beasts now loyal after being defeated in combat. Whether true or not, the symbolism resonates. These weren't just trained soldiers, but creatures molded by the wilderness itself. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great allegedly asked a Scythian envoy why his people didn't settle down and farm like civilized nations, the reply was telling. Why plant seeds in dirt when we plant boys in the steppe and harvest men of iron? Every empire that later underestimated them learned the hard way what looked like barbarism was actually the world's most ruthless military academy, with graduation day measured in blood and survival. This extreme conditioning created soldiers who viewed war not as an exception, but as an extension of daily life. While Greek hoplites drilled in formation a few hours a day before returning to civilian trades, Scythian males spent every waking moment honing skills that kept them alive. An Athenian might set aside his shield to sculpt marble or debate philosophy. A Scythian's bow was never out of reach, his saddle never cold for long. The difference showed in battle where one fought for glory or orders. The other fought with the instinctive, terrifying efficiency of a predator who knew no other way to exist. While modern armies stockpile antibiotics, the Scythians wielded something far more primal: the silent terror of pestilence. Historical accounts describe their chilling tactic of driving diseased livestock toward enemy camps, turning nature's most vicious killers into weapons. Imagine Persian soldiers waking to find their perimeter breached not by warriors, but by feverish cattle staggering into their midst, their hides splotched with lesions, their breath thick with contagion. Within days, the real invasion would begin not with arrows, but with chills, vomiting, and bodies piling faster than graves could be dug. The ancient Greeks whispered of darker variations. During sieges along the Black Sea coast, defenders allegedly watched helplessly as Scythian raiders catapulted rotting corpses over city walls. The stench alone was weaponized, a psychological assault that foreshadowed the medieval plague victims hurled into besieged cities centuries later. But the true horror lay in what came after: dysentery ripping through cramped quarters, typhus spreading via lice-infested furs traded under false pretenses, whole garrisons collapsing without a single blade drawn. Scholars still debate whether these nomads intentionally understood germ theory or merely exploited patterns observed over generations. Yet forensic archaeology offers grim clues. Excavated Scythian arrowheads show residue of botulism toxins, while mass graves near ancient battlefields reveal skeletons with telltale bone lesions from chronic infections. The timing is equally damning. Outbreaks in European settlements often followed Scythian raids along trade routes, hinting at history's first documented case of biological warfare. The ethical lines blur when viewed through an ancient lens. Unlike modern bans on chemical weapons, Bronze Age warfare had no Geneva Conventions. For the Scythians, survival justified any means, and what could be more efficient than letting invisible allies do the killing? Yet even contemporary historians like Herodotus expressed revulsion, describing poisoned wells as the act not of warriors but of angry spirits. Perhaps the most unsettling legacy lies in the unintended consequences. Genetic studies suggest some European plague strains originated near Scythian territories, carried westward along the very trade networks these nomads disrupted. A grim irony emerges: the same tactics that shattered armies may have seeded pandemics that reshaped continents. The lesson echoes through millennia. In war, sometimes the deadliest victories leave no witnesses, only unanswered questions buried with the bones. The Scythians didn't just ride horses into battle, they weaponized the entire herd. Picture this: a Persian phalanx braces for the familiar sight of mounted archers, only to see the horizon darken with something far more terrifying: a thundering tide of riderless horses, hundreds strong, their hooves churning the earth into dust as they stampede straight into the enemy ranks. This was the horse tide, a tactic so simple yet devastating that it turned the Scythians' greatest resource into a living battering ram. Steppe ponies were bred for this chaos: compact, muscular beasts with nerves of steel, capable of charging through smoke, noise, and the scent of blood without breaking stride. While other cultures prized war horses for size or speed, the Scythians valued something else: numbers. A single nomadic clan might own hundreds of horses, with only a fraction trained for riding. The rest expendable shock troops. Greek historians describe the aftermath: Their spare horses roll forward like a flood, snapping spear shafts like twigs, trampling men into the mud before the first arrow even flies. The brilliance lay in its economy. Unlike war elephants, exotic, expensive, and prone to panicking, steppe ponies were cheap, plentiful, and conditioned from birth to follow the herd. Scythian handlers would drive them forward with fire arrows or rawhide whips, their sheer momentum shattering formations that could withstand a cavalry charge. Persian scrolls recount the horror of infantrymen caught in these equine tsunamis, shields splintered under hoofbeats, disciplined ranks dissolved into chaos, and by the time the dust settled, Scythian archers were already circling to pick off survivors. Archaeology reveals the scale of this operation. Burial mounds from Kazakhstan to Hungary contain mass horse graves, some with over 400 animals interred alongside a single chieftain. Forensic analysis shows many lacked bridle marks, proving they were never ridden, just bred, raised, and ultimately sacrificed as weapons. Modern rodeo horses bolt at fireworks. Scythian ponies charge through walls of spear points because they'd been trained to think as one collective force. The closest ancient equivalent was the Indian war elephant, a towering beast that inspired similar terror. But elephants had weaknesses. They required decades to train, tropical climates to thrive, and panicked easily when wounded. The horse tide required none of this. A Scythian boy could rear a new wave of living projectiles in 3 years, and if the first charge failed, there were always more herds grazing beyond the horizon. Tactically, this was less a charge than a calculated demolition. Horses don't attack, they flee perceived threats en masse. The Scythians exploited this instinct by directing their stampedes into bottlenecks where enemies had no room to dodge. One Persian survivor wrote of a ravine where his regiment was trapped. The horses came not as animals, but as a single crushing weight, their bodies piling so high that the ones behind climbed over the dead to reach us. What made this tactic truly revolutionary was its psychological edge. After enduring a horse tide, even veteran troops flinched at distant hoofbeats. The ground itself seemed to turn against them, every tremor signaling another possible avalanche of flesh and bone. By turning their most abundant resource into a weapon, the Scythians proved a brutal truth in warfare. Sometimes the deadliest thing you can hurl at an enemy isn't a spear or an arrow, but the weight of nature itself, unforgiving and unstoppable. While most ancient armies feared the dark, the Scythians turned night into their greatest ally. Under moonless skies, their raiding parties moved like shadows, hooves muffled with wool wrappings, metal gear secured to prevent clinking, even horses trained to navigate by starlight without whinnying. The Assyrians learned this horror first, and when frontier forts began vanishing overnight, their watchtowers ablaze before sentries could sound alarms. Unlike typical sieges with their predictable rhythms, these attacks left no warning. One moment, the desert wind would howl through the palisades. The next, arrows hissed from nowhere, their fletching designed to fly silently. By the time torches were lit, the raiders were already gone, taking weapons and food stores while leaving only footprints in the sand and the choking stench of burning timber. The brilliance lay in their biological edge. Scythian warriors consumed a diet rich in raw meat and fermented mare's milk, giving them exceptional night vision compared to grain-dependent foes. Greek physicians noted their ability to spot movement at distances where others saw only blackness, an adaptation honed by generations of hunting wolves under the steppe's starry vaults. Modern research suggests this may have been due to higher vitamin in an intake from animal livers, but to the Assyrian survivors it seemed like supernatural sight. One clay tablet recovered from Nineveh laments, "They move as if the sun still shines upon them, while our men stumble blind as newborns." But darkness was just one weapon in their psychological arsenal. The Scythians mastered an even subtler tactic, the art of the whispered lie. When facing settled empires like Persia, they exploited every crack in the political facade. Spies disguised as merchants would slip into subject territories, spreading rumors of tax increases or secret conscription decrees, rebellions they didn't start but eagerly fueled. A fragmentary Babylonian scroll describes the aftermath. The governor's man found 6 villages empty. Their people fled to the hills after hearing the king would take their firstborn sons. No such order existed, but the nomads' tongues had sown the seed. The synergy between these tactics was devastating. Night raids created an atmosphere of unpredictability, while whisper campaigns eroded trust in central authority. During Darius's disastrous invasion, entire regiments of conscripted Medes and Armenians deserted after hearing fabricated stories that the Persians planned to sacrifice them as scouts. Meanwhile, Scythian warbands systematically dismantled supply lines under cover of darkness, their movements concealed by the very chaos they'd engineered. Archaeology confirms the scale of this psychological warfare. At a ruined Assyrian fort near modern Armenia, excavators found cuneiform tablets begging for reinforcements against phantom armies that left no trace by daylight. Elsewhere, Persian propaganda steels angrily denounced the lies that slither like serpents from the north. The lesson was clear. While other empires waged war with swords and spears, the Scythians fought with shadows and suspicion, turning the minds of their enemies into battlegrounds more lethal than any plane of combat. What made these tactics so revolutionary was their scalability. A handful of well-placed whispers could destabilize a province for months, while a single night raid might tie down regiments searching for a foe that never stood still. Unlike the rigid formations of classical armies, the Scythians' strength lay in their elusiveness, not just physically, but in the very way they occupied the mental space of their adversaries. After enough midnights spent waiting for an attack that might come anywhere or any moment, even the bravest soldiers began questioning their leaders, their neighbors, even their own senses. And in that corrosive doubt, the real victory took root long before the first arrow flew. The Scythians didn't just retreat, they dissolved into the landscape like mist under a morning sun. When pursued, they employed a vanishing act so complete that entire armies chasing them would wake to find no tracks, no campfires, no sign their quarry had ever existed. This wasn't just evasion, it was geographical alchemy, turning the endless steppe into both shield and sword. While Roman legions fretted over mile markers and Persian columns clung to river valleys, the nomads slipped through hidden gullies and salt flats known only to their scouts. One Persian chronicler described the frustration. "We chased ghosts across a land that conspired to hide them, while our own supply wagons sank to their axles in mud they had somehow avoided." Their survival depended on intimate knowledge of secret oases, shallow springs disguised by reeds, hollows where snowmelt pooled long after the surface dried. Greek historians wrote of Scythian guides leading parched allies to water by smelling the wind or observing the flight patterns of certain birds. Meanwhile, imperial armies withered under the same sun, their engineers digging ever deeper wells only to strike brine. A Roman account from Crimea tells of soldiers drinking from a fresh stream the Scythians had deliberately avoided hours later. The entire century was convulsing from alkaloid poisoning. The land itself had become an accomplice. The contrast with settled empires couldn't have been starker. Where Persian quartermasters required 30 pounds of grain per soldier per day, Scythian riders carried leather bags of air-dried meat that needed no cooking. While Roman legions halted to build fortified camps each night, the nomads simply hobbled their horses in a circle and slept beneath their felt cloaks. Archaeologists have found Roman marching camps spaced precisely 18 miles apart, the maximum daily distance for an ox-drawn supply train. Scythian raiding parties covered twice that by riding fresh mounts in rotation, their mobility making mockery of rigid imperial logistics. What truly terrified their enemies wasn't the disappearance itself, but what came after. A Macedonian outpost near the Danube once spent weeks searching for a Scythian warband, only to have it materialize 200 miles behind their lines, having crossed a supposedly impassable marsh via a labyrinth of game trails. Another Persian force celebrated finding an abandoned campsite, not realizing the scattered horse dung was fresh, the ashes still warm beneath the surface. By the time they sounded the alarm, arrows were already slicing down from the high ground they just vacated. The secret lay in their relationship with the earth. While empires saw geography as something to conquer or map, the Scythians treated it as a living ally. They knew which grassy swalls hid quicks and where the steppe's thin crust concealed caverns perfect for ambush. Modern satellite imagery reveals their migration routes followed nearly invisible gradients, a slight rise here to avoid spring floods, a dip there to stay below sightlines. These weren't mere paths, but a clandestine highway system woven into the land itself. When the Roman general Crassus pursued them into what's now Ukraine, his scouts reported the enemy had fled beyond recovery. 3 days later, those same Scythians annihilated his rearguard. They doubled back by riding at night along dry riverbeds, erasing their hoofprints with trailing bundles of brush. The lesson echoes through military history. Against foes who treat terrain as a weapon, even the mightiest empire is just a visitor stumbling through someone else's hunting grounds. The steppe didn't hide the Scythians, it revealed them only when they chose to strike. Long before the first arrow flew, the Scythians had already begun their assault, not on the body but on the mind. Imagine standing in a Persian shield wall as dawn breaks, only to see the enemy's vanguard emerge from the mist not as men, but as nightmares given flesh. Warriors clad in armor etched with leering demon faces, their helmets crowned with antlers or jagged spikes, their cloaks stitched from the skins of wolves and bears still wearing their snarling heads. Then came the shamans, their bodies painted bone white, writhing in trances as they hurled curses across the battlefield that promised not just death but damnation. This wasn't just pageantry, it was psychological warfare refined into a sacred art. Archaeologists have unearthed the physical remnants of this terror in burial mounds across Ukraine and southern Russia. One particularly chilling discovery near the Don River revealed a chieftain's ritual mask, a bronze face frozen in a silent scream, its eye sockets stretched unnaturally wide, its teeth filed to points. Forensic analysis showed traces of hallucinogenic ointment smeared inside the nasal cavity, suggesting wearers inhaled psychotropic vapors to enhance their terrifying performances. Another dig uncovered armor plaques decorated with composite monstrosities, human faces blended with coiled serpents or rabid beasts, designed to flicker unsettlingly in firelight as warriors charged. But this went beyond aesthetics. The Scythians understood something modern militaries still grapple with: fear multiplies in the unknown. When Greek mercenaries faced them in battle, their accounts fixated on the shamans' rituals, how they'd slit the throats of white stallions over upturned shields, reading patterns in the frothing blood before screaming prophecies of doom. Persian scrolls describe captured scouts babbling about men who wore the faces of demons and spoke with the voices of dead kings. Whether the Scythians themselves believed in these curses mattered less than the fact their enemies did. The line between superstition and strategy blurred deliberately. A recovered Assyrian tablet recounts how Scythian raiders besieging a frontier fort left grotesque gifts at the gates each night: a doll crafted from enemy scalps one evening, a decapitated horse head stuffed with venomous spiders the next. By the 7th night, the garrison had abandoned their posts, convinced the Nomads commanded dark forces. Modern psychologists recognize this as a textbook case of cumulative stress, the slow erosion of morale through unpredictable horrors. What made these tactics uniquely devastating was their cultural precision. The Scythians tailored their horrors to exploit specific enemy beliefs. Against the nature-revering Persians, they'd desecrate sacred groves with impaled animal carcasses. When facing Greek colonists, they mimicked the monstrous imagery of Hades' underworld. Even their battle chants were psychological weapons. Linguists note how surviving fragments use guttural sounds and abrupt silences to trigger primal unease. The brilliance lay in its deniability. Unlike poisoned wells or biological attacks, ritual terror left no physical evidence. A Persian general couldn't prove the shaman's curse caused his men's panic attacks any more than a medieval army could disprove divine wrath. By weaponizing the supernatural, the Scythians ensured their enemies fought not just flesh and blood, but the unbearable weight of imagined horrors lurking beyond the next hill. Some victories don't require blades, only the certainty, deep in your enemy's gut, that the rules of this world no longer apply. The Scythians didn't fight as a single army. They moved like a pack of wolves, their war bands splitting apart and reuniting with a precision that left enemies chasing shadows. Picture a Persian column marching through the steppe, confident they've cornered a nomadic force, only to watch it fracture into a dozen smaller groups, each vanishing into different directions. Just as the frustrated pursuers pick one to follow, those scattered bands circle back, merging suddenly behind them like jaws snapping shut. This was the wolf pack strategy, a decentralized system of warfare so fluid that defeating one warp and meant nothing when 100 others still roamed free. Archaeological evidence reveals how this worked in practice. Excavated Scythian campsites show no grand headquarters or centralized supply depots. Instead, they're clusters of identical yurts spaced miles apart, each self-sufficient with its own forges, horse herds, and food stores. Greek historians noted the pattern. To kill a Scythian chieftain brings no victory, for 3 more rise from the grass to take his place. Even Darius the Great fell into this trap after annihilating what he thought was the main nomadic army. He soon found fresh war bands harassing his supply lines, their riders wearing the same wolf pelt cloaks as the warriors he'd supposedly crushed days before. The brilliance lay in their command structure, or lack of it. Unlike Persian satraps who waited for royal decrees, Scythian captains operated on simple rules: attack weak points, avoid pitched battles, and regroup at prearranged landmarks when separated. Modern militaries would recognize this as mission-type tactics, giving frontline units broad objectives while trusting their initiative. A war and spotting an undefended Persian grain convoy didn't need permission to strike. They simply acted, knowing others would exploit different opportunities elsewhere. Compare this to modern guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong's cell-based structure mirrored Scythian warband strike teams that melted into villages after ambushes, their independence making them immune to decapitation strikes. Even the US military's current drone warfare doctrine echoes the wolf pack's core principle: small, agile units coordinating not through hierarchy but shared awareness. The Scythians just did it without radios or satellites, using smoke signals and carved bone tokens left at trail markers to synchronize movements across hundreds of miles. What made this system nearly unstoppable was its resilience. Destroying a traditional army meant crushing its center of gravity, a capital, a supply hub, a royal guard. But the Scythians had no center. Every warband was its own master, yet instinctively acted in concert with others. Persian chronicles lamented the futility. For every tent we burn, 10 more appear where none stood before. Even Alexander the Great, facing similar steppe tactics centuries later, grudgingly admitted it was like trying to grasp smoke with bare hands. The lesson transcends ancient warfare. In business terms, the Scythians were history's first scalable startup, a loosely connected network that could expand or contract as conditions demanded. When opportunity beckoned, warbands coalesced into an avalanche of hooves and arrows. When outmatched, they dissolved into the wilderness, only to reconfigure elsewhere. Their true weapon wasn't the bow or the blade, but an organizational genius that turned the steppe itself into an endless chessboard, one where every piece could become a queen when the moment was right. The Scythians didn't just use the land, they transformed it into a devouring beast that swallowed armies whole. Ancient chronicles whisper of Persian regiments vanishing overnight, their last footprints ending abruptly at the edge of seemingly ordinary marshes. What appeared as solid ground to foreign eyes concealed death traps carefully enhanced by nomadic hands' quicks, and pits disguised with woven grass mats, peat bogs deepened by hidden channels diverting groundwater. Greek historians like Polyaenus described the horror. Their earth opens like the jaws of Hades, sucking down men and horses alike without ripple or scream. Recent geological surveys near the Dnieper River confirm these legends weren't mere myth. Core samples from suspected battle sites reveal unnatural layers of gravel beneath wetland surfaces, evidence of deliberate terrain engineering to accelerate liquefaction. When enemy cavalry charged across what looked like firm meadows, the Scythians would trigger these traps by cutting concealed retaining walls with ropes, flooding the substrate to create instant quicksand. One excavation exposed a ghastly time capsule, the perfectly preserved skeletons of 50 Persian spearmen, their bones still upright as if frozen mid-step, their bronze-scale armor dragged downward by the very ground they stood upon. The psychological mastery lay in staging these disasters at key moments. During Darius's invasion, scouts reported Scythian riders taunting the Persian vanguard from safe islands of grass islands that vanished when heavy infantry followed. Survivors wrote of watching comrades sink waist-deep, then chest-deep as nomads shot them like fish in a barrel from solid ground, the real cruelty. Rescuing some, a cuneiform tablet from Babylon recounts how the Scythians would toss ropes to a few drowning men, only to yank them backward into worse bogs once others rushed to help. Modern parallels exist in Vietnam's mangrove swamps or Russia's Rasputitsa mud seasons, but the Scythians pioneered this ecological warfare. They mapped the steppe's invisible anatomy, knowing which river bends deposited loose silt under thin crusts where beaver dams could be sabotaged to flood trails. When Greek colonists later tried settling near the Sea of Azov, they found their farmland mysteriously waterlogged each spring until starvation forced retreat. Core samples now show those fields were secretly connected to underground channels the nomads maintained for centuries. What separates this from simple ambush tactics is the lasting terror it implanted. Unlike an arrow that strikes once, these traps turned the earth itself into an active enemy. Persian drill masters began testing every footfall with spears slowing advances to a crawl. Supply trains took circuitous routes to avoid suspiciously lush valleys, stretching logistics to breaking point. Even in victory, survivors carried home a primal dread that the next step on any unfamiliar soil might be their last, the very ground beneath them a sleeping predator waiting for its master's signal to feed. The Scythians turned intoxication into a lethal performance art, stumbling, slurring, and spilling fermented mare's milk like drunkards to bait enemies into fatal mistakes. Persian scouts watching from distant ridges would report back in confusion. The feared steppe warriors appeared to be in a drunken stupor, their weapons discarded, their horses wandering untethered. It was an irresistible sight for commanders trained to see such disarray as weakness. But the moment enemy cavalry charged into what looked like easy prey, the drunks would sober up with terrifying speed, mounting up in seconds to carve through now disordered ranks. One Greek chronicle describes the carnage. They rose from their feigned stupor like demons from hell, their blades flashing faster than sober men could parry. This deception worked because it played on deep cultural biases. Settled civilizations like Persia and Greece viewed public drunkenness as disgraceful, a sign of barbarism. The Scythians weaponized that prejudice. Accounts from Herodotus describe their rituals involving kumis, a potent brew of fermented mare's milk, consumed in ceremonies that outsiders misinterpreted as mere debauchery. What enemies didn't realize was that Scythian warriors trained from childhood to function flawlessly under its influence. Modern experiments with traditional kumis show it contains roughly half the alcohol of wine, but delivers a rapid, short-lived buzz perfect for staged theatrics followed by swift combat readiness. Archaeology reveals clues to this psychological warfare. Excavated Scythian camps near battlefields contain absurdly large numbers of empty leather kumis flasks, far more than a war band could realistically consume. Some show deliberate puncture holes, suggesting staged spillage to sell the illusion. Even their posture was calculated. Recovered Grecian urns depict Scythians reclined in exaggerated, loose-limbed poses identical to Hellenic caricatures of drunkards, proof they studied and mirrored their enemies' stereotypes. The line between tactic and tradition blurred deliberately. Kumis was genuinely sacred to steppe cultures, used in rituals to commune with spirits. By incorporating it into warfare, the Scythians added layers of plausible deniability. Were those warriors truly honoring ancestors or just baiting a trap? The uncertainty paralyzed opponents. A Persian scroll recounts the dilemma. Do we attack them in disgrace and risk divine wrath? Or hesitate and let demons regain their senses? The genius of the drunken feint lay in its layered deception. It wasn't just about pretending to be vulnerable, it was about making the enemy believe they'd discovered that vulnerability themselves. When a Macedonian phalanx finally took the bait at a river crossing near the Danube, they found the incapacitated Nomads had secretly laced the ford with animal grease. As armored infantry slipped and flailed, the Scythians switched from staggering to slaughtering with chilling precision. The lesson was clear. In war, sometimes the most dangerous foe is the one who lets you think you've already won. The Scythians shattered another ancient taboo. They sent their women to war, and the psychological shock of facing female warriors paralyzed enemies steeped in patriarchal traditions. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote with a mix of horror and fascination about women who fought like men, rode like men, and died like men. Persian accounts describe the unnerving sight of lithe figures in scaled armor loosing arrows alongside their male counterparts, their long hair whipping behind them as they charged. The legends of the Amazons didn't spring from thin air. They were born from the very real terror of facing Scythian women on the battlefield. Archaeology confirms what written records only hinted at. Excavations across Ukraine and southern Russia have uncovered graves of high-status women buried with weapons identical to their male kin's: composite bows, quivers of arrows, even battle axes. One particularly striking find near the Don River held the skeleton of a teenage girl, her hip bones deformed from years on horseback, surrounded by 20 iron-tipped projectiles, and a Gorito's bow case decorated with scenes of griffins tearing apart deer. Forensic analysis revealed healed combat injuries: a sword slash across her collarbone, an arrowhead lodged in her femur. This wasn't ceremonial, she'd bled in battle and lived to fight again. The psychological advantage was immense. Imagine a Greek hoplite phalanx bracing for combat against the legendary Scythian horse archers, only to realize too late that the riders tearing through their flank were women. In a world where most Mediterranean cultures confined women to domestic roles, the sight shattered assumptions about who could be dangerous. Persian poetry from the era reveals the cognitive dissonance. They came upon us like furies, their faces fair as moonrise but their hands red as sunset. The confusion wasn't just cultural, it was tactical. Hesitation in battle is lethal, and the Scythians weaponized that split-second pause when an enemy warrior registered the gender of his opponent. But this wasn't mere shock value. Scythian society recognized talent regardless of sex. A nomadic lifestyle on the harsh steppe left no room for arbitrary divisions of labor. If you could ride and shoot, you fought. Greek colonists along the Black Sea traded with Scythian tribes for generations, yet their accounts still gasped at seeing girls as young as 7 practicing archery alongside boys. The Roman historian Tacitus later sneered at Germanic tribes for allowing women on battlefields, but the Scythians had pioneered it centuries earlier, turning social norms into strategic advantages. The link to Amazon myths runs deeper than scholars once thought. Recent DNA testing on skeletons from nomadic burial mounds labeled warrior women by local archaeologists revealed a staggering truth: nearly 40% were female, many with injuries consistent with combat. One kurgan in particular held a woman buried with a gold ceremonial headdress and a dagger still clenched in her skeletal hand. The legends weren't exaggerations, they were diluted memories of a culture that didn't see war as a masculine domain. Consider the ripple effects beyond the battlefield. When Alexander the Great faced Scythian forces near the Jaxartes River, his biographers made careful note of women among the enemy ranks, not as camp followers but as commanders. One intercepted scroll from a Macedonian officer warned, "Their queens give orders as sharply as their kings, and their daughters aim truer than our finest archers." The mere existence of female warriors forced opposing generals to question everything they knew about morale, leadership, and the very nature of their foes. In the end, the Scythians proved a timeless truth: the most dangerous weapon isn't always the one in your hand, but the one your enemy never thought to fear. The Scythians didn't just ride into battle, they conjured armies from thin air using nothing but sound. Imagine you're a Persian sentry guarding the edge of camp when a distant rumble builds on the wind, growing louder until it shakes the ground beneath your feet. You brace for the cavalry charge sure to crest the hill, but the horizon remains empty. This was the echo of hooves, a psych-acoustic illusion where Scythian drummers and metal clangers simulated the thunder of 1,000 galloping horses, tricking enemies into panicked defensive formations while the real strike force struck elsewhere. Historians believe they used hollowed logs stretched with horsehide, beaten with bone mallets to replicate the rhythmic pulse of a stampede. Other accounts describe warriors dragging bronze cauldrons filled with stones behind their mounts, creating a metallic roar that echoed unnaturally across the steppe's vast bowl. The effect was diabolically precise. Greek mercenary journals tell of entire phalanxes wheeling to face phantom charges, their shields locked against empty grasslands while Scythian archers picked them apart from the flanks. One recovered Assyrian clay tablet laments, "The sky itself seemed to tremble with the approach of their invisible herds. The genius lay in exploiting human instinct." Our brains are wired to prioritize auditory threats, a trait the Scythians weaponized. When Darius's army camped near the Volga, sentries reported cavalry approaching from 3 directions simultaneously. By the time commanders realized the sounds originated from just 40 riders circling with noisemakers, their archers had wasted precious arrows shooting at shadows, and their infantry were exhausted from repeatedly forming anti-cavalry squares. This tactic echoes through military history. During World War II, British engineers built ghost armies with loudspeakers broadcasting tank noises. The Viet Cong tied explosives to bamboo groves, mimicking artillery fire to misdirect American patrols. But the Scythians pioneered the art, turning acoustics into a weapon centuries before physics could explain why it worked. Recent archaeology near the Black Sea uncovered crescent-shaped bronze plates with wear patterns suggesting they were clashed together like cymbals, the first physical evidence of what Greek texts called the steppe's song of deceit. What made the echo of hooves so devastating was its scalability. A handful of drummers could simulate an entire division, stretching enemy forces thin as they scrambled to cover false threats. The Romans later documented Scythian variants, spooking supply horses with sudden metallic crashes, or luring scouts into ravines where amplified echoes made 5 riders sound like 50. In an era before radar or reconnaissance, sound was reality, and the Scythians, masters of the unseen, conducted their symphony of deception with the precision of musicians, each beat a note in the anthem of their enemies' unraveling. For the Scythians, surrender wasn't just defeat, it was an unthinkable blasphemy against everything their warrior culture stood for. Picture the aftermath of a brutal skirmish, Persian troops advancing on a wounded nomad, eager to take a living prisoner for interrogation or spectacle. Before they can close the gap, another Scythian wheels his horse around and puts an arrow through his comrade's heart without hesitation. No dramatic farewells, no pleas for mercy, just swift obliteration to deny the enemy even a shred of victory. Greek historians like Herodotus recorded this chilling practice with horrified fascination, describing how Scythian warriors carried special mercy blades to dispatch mortally wounded friends before enemies could reach them. This stark refusal of captivity upended every Mediterranean notion of honor. To the Greeks, yielding in battle wasn't shameful if one had fought bravely. Prisoners could be ransomed or enslaved, but survival itself held value. Persian warriors saw surrender as a negotiable act, sometimes even a strategic one. The Scythians spat on such logic. Their ethos held that a warrior's body and possessions existed solely to reflect glory in life or death. Letting an enemy claim either was the ultimate disgrace. Archaeological finds hammer this point home. Excavated battle sites show Scythian graves deliberately placed to trap enemy spirits according to steppe beliefs, while their own dead were meticulously collected whenever possible. A mass grave near the Danube revealed 20 Scythian skeletons, each with a single killing wound to the base of the skull, evidence of systematic, compassionate executions by their own kin. Forensic analysis shows these weren't crude blows but precise strikes, suggesting ritualized familiarity with the act. The psychological impact on enemies was devastating. Persian scrolls describe the demoralizing effect of watching Scythians fight with reckless abandon, knowing they'd never break or beg for quarter. Macedonian accounts tell of trying to capture high-ranking nomads, only to find them slumped over with self-inflicted dagger wounds moments before capture. Even Alexander the Great, no stranger to brutal warfare, reportedly ordered his men to take Scythian leaders alive at any cost, a command that went unfulfilled again and again. But this wasn't just individual bravery, it was institutionalized defiance. Scythian mothers allegedly handed sons a dagger at puberty with the instruction, "Return with it or upon it." Their death songs, preserved in fragments by Greek ethnographers, celebrate warriors who ate the sky rather than taste captivity. Modern psychology recognizes this as sacred value behavior, when a principle becomes so core to identity that compromise is literally inconceivable. The contrast with contemporary armies couldn't be starker. When Persian King Cyrus tried to intimidate a Scythian envoy by boasting of his vast prisons, the nomad famously replied, "We have no need for such buildings. Our graves are the only cages our enemies will ever possess." This ethos didn't just make them fearsome opponents, it rendered standard tactics of intimidation or coercion useless. You couldn't threaten a people who considered death preferable to subjugation, nor exploit prisoners who didn't exist. Their legacy echoes in unexpected places. Japanese samurai practiced similar ritual suicide to avoid capture, while Spartan mothers told sons to come home, with their shield or on it. But the Scythians took it further. Their refusal to be taken alive extended even to comrades, creating an unbreakable circle of mutual annihilation. In the end, they left enemies with nothing to grasp but shadows and dust, ensuring that even in defeat, they dictated the terms of remembrance. The message was clear. To face the Scythians was to gamble not just with your life, but with the very possibility of victory itself. The Scythians left behind a legacy carved in equal parts from brilliance and brutality, a paradox that still challenges how we define military genius. Their tactics weren't just effective, they rewrote the rules of engagement, forcing empires to confront a style of warfare where deception was as vital as strength, where the land itself turned traitor, and where victory belonged to those who could vanish as swiftly as they struck. They didn't just fight armies, they dismantled the very logic of how wars were won, proving that sometimes the sharpest weapon is the enemy's own uncertainty. But history struggles to categorize them. Were they savages, as the Greeks claimed, their scalps and skull cups evidence of mindless barbarism? Or were they visionary strategists, their decentralized war bands and psychological terror foreshadowing modern guerrilla tactics by millennia? Consider this: while Persian kings built roads and palaces, the Scythians built nothing except an empire of fear that stretched across the steppe without a single permanent wall. Their cities moved on horseback, their wealth measured not in gold but in the willingness to burn every pasture rather than let an enemy graze a single horse. The debate lingers because their methods defy easy judgment. Poisoned arrows and drowned messengers clash with our ideals of honorable combat, yet no one can deny their efficiency. Even Alexander the Great, who crushed Persia, chose diplomacy over confrontation when facing Scythian riders. Perhaps the truth lies in the middle. They were both savages and savants, their cruelty inseparable from their cunning. In a world where survival demanded ruthlessness, they perfected the art of making their enemies' strengths into liabilities. So what do you think? Were the Scythians bloodthirsty marauders, or were they unmatched tacticians who played the game of war 3 moves ahead of everyone else? Drop your take in the comments. I'd love to hear which of their tactics shocked or impressed you the most. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most feared horsemen, don't forget to subscribe. The past is full of stories that blur the line between monster and mastermind, and we've only just begun to uncover them.